The U.S. state of Texas declared its secession from the United States of America on February 1, 1861, and joined the Confederate States on March 2, 1861. After it replaced its governor, Sam Houston, when he refused to take an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. Some Texan military units fought in the Civil War east of the Mississippi River, but Texas was most useful for supplying soldiers and horses for Confederate forces. Texas' supply role lasted until mid-1863, after which time Union gunboats controlled the Mississippi River, making large transfers of men, horses or cattle impossible. Some cotton was sold in Mexico, but most of the crop became useless because of the Union naval blockade of Galveston, Houston, and other ports. Secession. In the late winter of 1860, Texan counties sent delegates to a special convention to debate the merits of secession. The convention adopted an ordinance of secession, by a vote of 166 to 8, which was ratified by a popular referendum on February 23. Separately from the ordinance of secession, which was considered a legal document, Texas also issued a declaration of causes spelling out the rationale for declaring secession. The document specifies several reasons for secession, including its solidarity with its sister slaveholding states, the U.S. government's inability to prevent Indian attacks, slave-stealing raids, and other border-crossing acts of banditry. It accuses Northern politicians and abolitionists of committing a variety of outrages upon Texans. The bulk of the document offers justifications for slavery and white supremacy, saying that remaining a part of the United States would jeopardize the security of the two. The declaration includes this extract praising slavery, in which the Union itself is referred to as the Confederacy. We hold as undeniable truths that the governments of the various states, and of the Confederacy itself, were established exclusively by the white race, for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. Texas Secession Convention, a declaration of the causes which impelled the state of Texas to secede from the federal union. At this time, blacks comprised 30% of the state's population, and they were overwhelmingly enslaved. According to one Texan, keeping them enslaved was the primary goal of the state in joining the Confederacy. Independence without slavery would be valueless. The South without slavery would not be worth a mess of pottage. Caleb Cutwell, Letter to the Galveston Tri-Weekly. Secession Convention and the Confederacy following the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Public opinion in the Cotton States of the Lower South swung in favor of secession. By February 1861, the other 6 states of the sub-region had separately passed ordinances of secession. However, events in Texas were delayed, largely due to the resistance of Southern Unionist Governor Sam Houston. Unlike the other Cotton States chief executives, who took the initiative in secessionist efforts, Houston refused to call the Texas legislature into special session to consider the question, relenting only when it became apparent citizens were prepared to act without him. In early December 1860, before South Carolina even seceded, a group of state officials published via newspaper a call for a statewide election of convention delegates on January 8, 1861. This election was highly irregular, even for the standards of the day. It often relied on voice vote at public meetings, although viva voce voting for popular elections had been used since at least March 1846, less than 3 months after statehood. Unionists were often discouraged from attending or chose not to participate. This resulted in lopsided representation of secessionist delegates. The election call had stipulated for the delegates to assemble in convention on January 28. Houston called the legislature into session, hoping that the elected body would declare the unauthorized convention illegal. On January 21, 1861, the legislature met in Austin and was addressed by Houston. Calling Lincoln's election unfortunate, he nonetheless emphasized, in a reference to the upcoming meeting of the Secession Convention, it was no justification for rash action. However, the Texas legislature voted the delegates' expense money and supplies and, over Houston's veto, made a pledge to uphold the legality of the convention's actions. The only stipulation was that the people of Texas have the final say in referendum. With gubernatorial forces routed, the Secession Convention convened on January 28 and, in the first order of business, voted to back the legislature 140-28 in that an ordinance of secession, if adopted, be submitted for statewide consideration. The following day, Convention President Oral Roberts introduced a resolution suggesting Texas leave the Union. The ordinance was read on the floor the next day, citing the failures of the federal government to protect the lives and property of Texas citizens and accusing the northern states of using the same as a weapon to strike down the interests and prosperity of the southern people. After the grievances were listed, the ordinance repealed the one of July 4, 1845, in which Texas approved annexation by the United States and the Constitution of the United States, and revoked all powers of obligation to and allegiance to the U.S. federal government and the U.S. Constitution. In the interest of historical significance and posterity, the ordinance was written to take effect on March 2, the date of Texas' Declaration of Independence. On February 1, members of the legislature, and a huge crowd of private citizens, packed the House galleries and balcony to watch the final vote on the question of secession. 70 yea votes were recorded before there was a single nay. One of the negative votes is enshrined in Texas history books. James Webb Throckmorton, from Collin County in North Texas, in response to the roar of hisses and boos and catcalls which greeted his decision, retorted, "When the rabble hiss, well, make patriots tremble." Appreciating his style, the crowd afforded him a grudging round of applause. The final tally for secession was 166-7, a vote whose legality was upheld by the Texas legislature on February 7. Other than in South Carolina, where the vote was unanimous, this was the highest percentage of any other state of the Lower South. On February 7, the legislature ordered a referendum to be held on the ordinance under the direction of the convention. The decision was further affirmed on February 23 when a statewide referendum resulted in Texas voters approving the measure, 46,129 to 14,697. The last order of business was to appoint a delegation to represent Texas in Montgomery, Alabama, where their counterparts from the other 6 seceding states were meeting to form a new confederacy. On March 4, the convention assembled again to formally declare Texas out of the Union and to approve the Constitution of the Confederate States of America, which had been drawn up by its Provisional Congress. In March, George Williamson, the Louisiana State Commissioner, addressed the Texan Secession Convention, where he called upon Texas and the slave states of the U.S. to declare secession from the Union in order to continue the institution of slavery. With the social balance wheel of slavery to regulate its machinery, we may fondly indulge the hope that our Southern government will be perpetual. Louisiana looks to the formation of a Southern Confederacy to preserve the blessings of African slavery. George Williamson, speech to the Texan Secession Convention. Governor Sam Houston accepted secession but asserted that the convention had no power to link the state with the new Southern Confederacy. Instead, he urged that Texas revert to its former status as an independent republic and stay neutral. Houston took his seat on March 16, the date state officials were scheduled to take an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. He remained silent as his name was called out 3 times and, after failing to respond, the office of governor was declared vacant and Houston was deposed from office. Seizure of federal property and arms. After Texas passed its Ordinance of Secession, the state government appointed 4 men as Commissioners of Public Safety to negotiate with the federal government for the safe transfer of military installations and bases in Texas to the Confederates. Along with Land Baron Samuel A. Maverick and Thomas J. Devine, Dr. Philip N. Luckett met with U.S. Army General David E. Twiggs on February 8, 1861, to arrange the surrender of the federal property in San Antonio, including the military stores being housed in the old Alamo Mission. As a result of the negotiations, Twiggs delivered his entire command and its associated Army property to the Confederacy, an act that brought cries of treason from Unionists throughout the state. Almost immediately, Twiggs was dismissed from the U.S. Army by President Buchanan for treachery to the flag of his country. Shortly afterwards, he accepted a commission as general in the Confederate Army but was so upset by being branded a traitor that he wrote a letter to Buchanan stating the intention to call upon him for a personal interview. Future Confederate General Robert E. Lee, then still a colonel in the U.S. Army, was in San Antonio at the time and when he heard the news of the surrender to Texas authorities, responded, "Has it come so soon as this?" Unionist sentiment and opposition to the Confederacy. Despite the prevailing view of the vast majority of the state's politicians and the delegates to the Secession Convention, there were a significant number of Texans who opposed secession. The referendum on the issue indicated that some 25% favored remaining in the Union at the time the question was originally considered. The largest concentration of anti-secession sentiment was among the German Texan population in the Texas Hill Country, and in some of the counties of North Texas. In the latter region, most of the residents were originally from states of the Upper South. Some of the leaders initially opposed to secession accepted the Confederate cause once the matter was decided. Some withdrew from public life, others left the state, and a few even joined the Union Army. Confederate conscription laws forced most men of military age into the Confederate Army, regardless of their sentiment. However, at least 2,000 Texans joined the Union ranks. Many Unionists were executed. Conscription into the Confederate Army was unacceptable to many Unionists and some attempted to flee from Texas. Captain James Duff, Confederate Provost Marshal for the Hill Country, executed 2 Unionists, prompting flight. In August 1862, Confederate soldiers under Lt. Colin D. McRae tracked down a band of German Texans headed out of state and attacked their camp in a bend of the Nueces River. After a pitched battle that resulted in the deaths of 2 Confederates and the wounding of McRae and 18 of his men, the Unionists were routed. Approximately 19 Unionists were killed in the fighting. After the battle, 9 to 11 of the wounded Unionists were murdered with shots to the head in what became known as the Nueces Massacre. Another 9 Unionists were pursued and executed in the following weeks. The German population around Austin County, led by Paul McAmale, was successful in reaching Mexico. In October 1862, approximately 150 settlers in and around Cook County on the Red River were arrested by the 11th Texas Cavalry led by Colonel William C. Young on the orders of Colonel James Borland, Confederate Provost Marshal for Northern Texas. A court was convened in Gainesville to try them for allegedly plotting to seize the arsenals at Sherman and Gainesville and to kill their Confederate neighbors, seize their property, and to cooperate with Union Army forces poised to invade northern Texas from Arkansas and/or Indian Territory. Several of the settlers were hanged in what is now downtown Gainesville during the first week of October. 19 additional men were found guilty and hanged before the end of the month. A total of about 40 Unionists were hanged in Gainesville, 2 were shot while trying to escape, and 2 more were hanged elsewhere after being turned over to a military tribunal. Under the primitive conditions on the Texas frontier during the Civil War, evidence against the accused was questionable, and the legal proceedings were highly imperfect. A granite monument in a small park marks the spot where the hangings took place. The Confederacy's Conscription Act proved controversial, not only in Texas but all across the South. Opponents argued that the war was being fought by poor people on behalf of a few wealthy slave owners. The act exempted from the draft men who owned 15 or more slaves. Draft resistance was widespread, especially among Texans of German or Mexican descent. Many of the latter went to Mexico. Potential draftees went into hiding, Confederate officials hunted them down, and many were shot or captured and forced into the Army. Sam Houston was the premier Southern Unionist in Texas. While he argued for slave property rights and deplored the election of the Lincoln administration, he considered secession unconstitutional and thought secession at that moment in time was a rash action that was certain to lead to a conflict favoring the industrial and populated North. He predicted, "Let me tell you what is coming. After the sacrifice of countless millions of treasure and hundreds of thousands of lives, you may win Southern independence if God be not against you, but I doubt it. I tell you that, while I believe with you in the doctrine of states' rights, the North is determined to preserve this union. They are not a fiery, impulsive people as you are, for they live in colder climates. But when they begin to move in a given direction, they move with the steady momentum and perseverance of a mighty avalanche, and what I fear is, they will overwhelm the South." Houston rejected the actions of the Texas Secession Convention, believing it had overstepped its authority in becoming a member state of the newly formed Confederacy. He refused to take an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy and was deposed from office, saying, "Fellow citizens, in the name of your rights and liberties, which I believe have been trampled upon, I refuse to take this oath. In the name of the nationality of Texas, which has been betrayed by the Convention, I refuse to take this oath. In the name of the Constitution of Texas, I refuse to take this oath. In the name of my own conscience and manhood, which this Convention would degrade by dragging me before it, to pander to the malice of my enemies, I refuse to take this oath. I deny the power of this Convention to speak for Texas. I protest against all the acts and doings of this Convention, and I declare them null and void." After his ouster from the governor's office, Houston maintained a low public profile until his death in July 1863. Houston later wrote her friend, "There comes a time a man's section is his country. I stand with mine.